188 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. We're glad to have you with us. And woohoo! The February 2018 exams are in the books. If I sound a little froggy, it's for two reasons. One is the bar exam is in the books, and I usually get pretty close to laryngitis at this stage of the year. And secondly, I am fighting terrible allergies. Now, I know that's a nice problem to have relative to those of you, I think, in the Midwest and Northeast who are apparently going to be dealing with horrible weather in the coming weekend and the week ahead. So I realize it's not the worst problem one could have, but oh my gosh, my nose is making me crazy. So hopefully we'll stop this a couple of times. Let me blow my nose. But I'm afraid this is just, I'm going to just sound kind of congested here. In any event, we're really glad that you're with us. If this is your first time on the podcast, welcome. We offer this podcast every week on Wednesday mornings, and it's an opportunity to talk about all things bar exam related. And of course, you found us hopefully either on iTunes or Spotify or iHeartRadio, but you can also watch our podcasts on video by going to celebrationbarreview.com / and then enter the episode number. Today it's 188. So if you'd like to watch this video, just go to celebrationbarreview.com / 188, and we've got all of our show notes on the video page as well. Well, I do want to say congratulations to everyone that finished their exam. We're just wrapping up in Texas right now as I'm recording. And in today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about what the early poll results are as people have come back from the exams. We're going to talk today about California, Florida, and the UBE, a little bit about the multi-state. In a later episode, we'll talk about Texas and Georgia, but I thought we'd talk about those three major states today and kind of bring everybody up to date on what we've heard so far. Now, obviously, as I'm recording this, these are just the very first impressions from students coming out of the exams. So it's all subject to change and reflection and the opportunity to work through and get a little deeper into the material. So stick around for that. We're going to go to that in just a moment. Before we talk about the updates and what happened in February 2018, I want to invite all of you to join us this coming Thursday. It's March 8th for a special free webinar, How to Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. It's a look at the powerful, proven way to pass. And in this webinar, I'm going to be showing you the 4 steps that successful students follow in order to pass their bar exams. We've got it filled with lots of case studies, lots of information, a step-by-step roadmap that you can follow. And I hope you'll join me. It's at 7 p.m. Eastern. That'll be 4 p.m. Pacific time. And you do need to register, and you can register in one of a couple of ways. There is a link in the show notes if you're listening to today's podcast. There's also a link on the video page if you're watching, or you can go to our webpage at celebrationbarreview.com and you'll see a button there to claim your free seat. Now, if Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern doesn't work for you, we also offer the same webinar on a daily on-demand basis. Of course, the only difference is it's not live, but I'll be glad to answer questions by email if you're doing the on-demand version. And in that on-demand version, you can set the time that you want to listen and the day that you want. So it's totally up to you. Same great material either way, but we really encourage you to join us for that. I know that as people come out of the exams, for those of you that are February bar takers, that there's going to be an inevitable period in which you want to do a post-mortem of the exam. You want to talk it through. That's part of what we're going to do today. And a few episodes back, I did an episode just about this idea of doing a post-mortem. It's episode 156, and we're going to link to that in the show notes. So if you're interested in some things that we think you should be doing when it comes to evaluating your performance after the exam, check out episode 156. Also, if you're worried about what do I do while I'm waiting for bar results to come out, which is a pretty normal thing, episode 161 was on that topic, and we'll link to that as well. So a couple of opportunities for you there to get some additional information about how to evaluate the process and what happened. Well, as I said, what we want to do today is to take a quick first cut look at what we're hearing out of the exams, what students are telling us, subject to change, because of course as people memory kind of solidifies as we hear from more people, we get a better sense of what was actually on the exam. In every jurisdiction except Florida, we have to wait for the actual questions until a later date. Now, Florida does allow the essay questions to come out of the room, so there we're pretty sure about what was actually tested. But everywhere else, the Uniform Bar Exam, California, Texas, Georgia, we don't know the official word until a little bit further down the road. So this is what we know generally about the exam, and we want to share that with you. In part, if you took the exam, to give you a sense of what other people are saying. But if you haven't taken the exam, I think it's very useful to get a feeling for what was tested and the general feedback that goes with it. Now, before I get to the specific states, California, Florida, and the UBE, I guess I have to talk about the elephant in the room, which again comes under the name of ExamSoft. That's right. The bar exam software for essays did its usual unbelievably screwed up job. Back in 2014, ExamSoft had a major meltdown, wasn't able to accept essays as they were being submitted by bar takers around the country. It was a night of chaos and ultimately led to a class action suit, a settlement, and a promise from the folks at ExamSoft that they had figured everything out. Well, apparently they haven't figured everything out. They've changed their name to, what do they call it now? Examplify, but it's still Bar Exam. It's still ExamSoft. And apparently there were still problems. Now, what happened in February is that right before the exam, there were a series of urgent updates to the software that were made just less than a week before the exam itself. And there were 6 emails, is what we were told, that came from ExamSoft in the 6 days before the bar exam. Now, if you did that, if you got the emails and you did that, you were generally okay, but not everyone was. And a lot of people, frankly, didn't see the emails. So they got to the exam centers around the country, and lo and behold, the software didn't work. And proctors in different jurisdictions handled that problem differently. In Albany, New York, the software didn't work for apparently about half of the applicants in that center, and so the exam was delayed by 30 minutes on Tuesday. That's the UBE. In Florida, you would know in Florida, they had the same problem, and they actually started the exam about 45 minutes late in Florida. You can only imagine the chaos that causes the Florida bar examiners, just not good at all. Most of the problems were resolved. Those are just a couple of examples. There were problems in California. I mean, it was literally around the country. In general, what the examiners did in each location was to give an extra 30 minutes to the testing session. In some cases, particular applicants got less time than that because it took more time to fix their software. Now, I don't know what the result of that will be ultimately, except that, again, this software just doesn't seem very reliable. But the reality is that stuff happens, and apparently the way that it's going to be resolved will be on a state-by-state and in some cases at an exam site-by-exam site basis. That's not a great way to operate. Now, does that mean you should handwrite your essays? Absolutely not. You should still type. You should still be prepared to type. That's our absolute advice to people. But clearly you got to know that there's a possibility of something going wrong. And I guess one of the things you got to do is you got to check the bar examiner's websites frequently. You got to check your email. I think it's a problem. We'll see what the examiners choose to do about it. I'll tell you that back in 2014, there were no changes made to any scores or grades. So I think it's very unlikely that any adjustment will be made for anybody's scores on the Tuesday day of the exam, the state essay exams. So I wouldn't expect anything in that regard. What will ExamSoft have to say about it? Well, they haven't said much yet. I think that they're probably being very careful after the experience of a few years ago. But we'll keep you updated as we hear about that. And our thanks to Stacy Zarefsky at Above the Law, who broke that story and has been keeping people up to date on what's going on there. All right, well, with that happy news behind us, let's go ahead and turn our attention to the California exams. We'll start there. And in California, we have in the new format, and this is the second administration of the new 2-day format, we have now 5 one-hour essays and 1 90-minute performance test. And this is an interesting new format. It replaces the old 3-day test that had 6 essays and 2 3-hour performance tests. And it changes the scoring. Those weighted scoring now is 50% multi-state, 50% written portion. So there is certainly a lesser impact of the written part than there used to be in California. Well, here's what we heard in terms of the subject matter of the essays. And again, this is all subject to revision as we go forward. But the first words we're getting is that there was a contracts rescission question. There was a professional responsibility question. There was a federal constitutional law question. There was a torts and property crossover question. And then there was a criminal procedure, criminal law question, which again, sort of a crossover, if you will. And then there was a wills question that may have had some community property in it as well. So those were the 5 essays. Now, some people thought that the torts property question had a little bit of con law to it, but it seems to us from what people are saying, it's probably torts property, particularly since there was a separate con law question. In the property question, it was one that people remarked, they seemed to kind of like it. It was a nuisance with trespass to chattel. There was some conversion. A neighbor cut some wires. The crossover and the way it got into property or maybe con law was that there's a condemnation from the government, and so a takings response might be appropriate. So whether or not the examiners will call that property or property con law, I'm not sure, but apparently we've got some takings in that particular question. So we got a lot of comment about that particular question. I did get an interesting response. The criminal procedure question, people in my course actually said it was actually fun to answer. Now that's a weird response to me. You know, I had fun with that question. Essentially, it's not that the subject matter was fun, but apparently it was a good one to work with. There was a missing child. Officers were searching for the child, and they were seizing evidence with a warrant in progress. So there was some question about that. Apparently it was a pretty, the word I heard, 2 words, fun and straightforward on that particular one. With respect to the professional responsibility question, it also seemed pretty straightforward. It was in the context of an evidence setting, but the call was only for the ethics violations of the attorney when the expert witness that the attorney had was being cross-examined. So that's at least what we're hearing about that. Not much else to tell you. The contracts rescission, that's a pretty standard law school kind of question about you've got a contract and one of the party wants to rescind. So that's essentially what we heard about the essays. I don't have a lot to tell you about the con law question at this point. For whatever reason, that one didn't seem to resonate in people's brains quite as strongly as some of these other subjects. Then we had the performance test in California. Again, this is the new format of the 90-minute performance test. And this performance test was an objective memo. It dealt with problems related to a contract versus a gift. And there were questions about standing to sue and trust implications. Our students said that they thought it was an interesting problem. It really could have been an interesting piece to write if they'd had more time. But I got the comment, I enjoyed writing it even in the small amount of time. I saw that a lot. The trick was, as one student said, the facts talked about standing, and there was a case in the library apparently all about standing, but there was no specific question asked about standing. So we'll see whether or not the examiners wanted that writing to happen or not. Some people wrote about standing, apparently some didn't. So we'll see what that looks like when we get into the question itself. So that's generally what we heard in California. I would say none of that is really surprising. These are all pretty straightforward subjects. One of the interesting things to me is we didn't get California-specific civil procedure. We didn't get California-specific evidence. We didn't get, maybe we got a little bit of community property, but essentially the exam seemed to stay in the generic multi-state realm. I think that's interesting because there's certainly been a trend towards moving to the California-specifically subjects. This exam, not so much of that. So I was surprised about that. I thought that my students coming out of California seemed pretty confident about how the exam went for them and pretty happy about the test, generally speaking. It's a tough exam for sure, but I think that people felt like it was a reasonable test. So that's what we know about California. And of course, we'd love to get your comments and notes when you have the opportunity. And we'd love to hear what you think about the exam itself. Well, next I want to talk about the Uniform Bar Exam. This is the exam that's given around the country in about 30 plus jurisdictions, including New York and New Jersey, D.C., a lot of jurisdictions in the West. Same test everywhere. And again, the format of the UBE is that you have 6 essay questions, 30 minutes each, and 2 performance tests. So here's what we heard, and again, this is very early information, but the essay topics that we understood to be there were a family law question, a civil procedure question, a contracts question, a real property question, criminal law question, and agency partnership. Now, I think that this is, again, pretty straightforward and not terribly surprising in terms of the subject matter. Family law continues to be a mystery to me as to why it's even on the UBE, because it's such a state-specific topic. Nonetheless, there it is, and it was on this particular exam. The examiners have for some time now been testing civil procedure frequently, and so we had another federal civil procedure question. Again, that's not a real surprise to me. Contracts is one of those topics that I think you just assume that contracts, torts, and property, there's going to be 2 out of those 3 on most exams. On this exam, it was a contracts question and then a real property question. Crim law might have been one of the subjects that surprised some people, but it's, again, a standard MBE topic, and there wasn't much comment, at least so far early on, that we're hearing about that. Agency partnership is interesting to me. We do see a fair number of questions coming more in the agency partnership realm than in business entities or corporations. So I think that reflects a sense that new attorneys might be asked to deal with agency problems or partnership problems more frequently than if they'd be asked to deal with a corporation. So again, nothing really surprising, no great amount of comment or feedback on it. It seemed like it was a pretty straightforward but not easy exam, that's for sure. But that's what we heard about that. As far as the 2 performance tests, performance test number 1 was a brief in opposition to a motion to prevent victim damage declarations in sentencing and a right to restitution damages. The examiners wanted it to be compelling. I would say that means persuasive. And so a brief in opposition, we're writing to a legal audience, and it was persuasive. Then the second performance test was a memorandum regarding an advisory opinion as to someone who was contemplating a job as an election judge or a precinct chair while being a member of the board of directors of a utility board, a local utility. Seems kind of obscure to me, but in any event, seemed like not certainly an objective task. It's an advisory opinion, so you're writing functionally in a legal sense. And this is this very narrow world of, can you have a job as an election judge or a precinct chair and still be on your local utility board? Because that comes up all the time for people. So there you go. So that was an interesting question, I thought, to have there. So that's what we saw on the 2 performance tests. Now, the performance tests, both of those performance tests would have been in Georgia as well as the UBE, and one of those 2 in Texas. And as we're talking today, I don't know which one Texas selected, so we'll find that out and let you know. But those are our 2 performance tests and our essays. And again, I would say in general, not all that much to talk about in the essays at this point. Our students felt pretty good about it. They felt like they were manageable. The call to the questions weren't too long. There weren't any excessive 7 or 8 calls of the question in 30-minute kinds of problems. So that's good news, and we will share more as we find out more. But those are our subjects. And then the third state that I wanted to talk about today was Florida. Good old Florida. In Florida, what we've got are 3 one-hour essays in the morning, and then 90 scored questions, multiple choice questions, drawn from 3 topics in the afternoon. So the essay topics in Florida this year, the first question was criminal law with an emphasis on juvenile delinquency. The second question was Florida constitutional law, straight up. And the third question was multistate property. Now, with respect to these essay questions, one of the things I can tell you is that in the property question, it was a condominium that had a homestead exemption. There were some unpaid homeowners association fees, judgment liens, loans made without the spouse's consent, and a little bit of mortgages in there. So a lot of interesting stuff going on in that question, and that was the last of the essays, the property question. The first essay, criminal law, had a little bit of criminal procedure in it, according to some students. The juvenile delinquency part was interesting to me because the juvenile delinquency is not something the examiners in Florida have tested previously. They have talked about dependency, but not delinquency. So now we have something for the first time moving into juvenile delinquency. And so that was new material, I think, for a lot of bar takers. I was pleased that our students had prepared for that, and they seemed like they were pretty ready for it and ready to go on. So juvenile delinquency was an interesting question. One of the other interesting things to point out here is that for the first time that I can remember, and I mean like in 20 years, there was no professional responsibility on any of the three essays. Didn't show up as any part of any of the three questions. I can't recall, as I say, a time when that's happened. That was a surprise to me. I don't know that it means anything, but it was an interesting veering away because every exam up to this point has always had at least one, and in some cases three questions that had professional responsibility as a crossover, but we didn't see anything in the questions. So that was definitely a surprise. So that is what we've got there. The con law question, as I say, had a lot going on as well. So con law and property, two tough subjects, I think. I would say most students felt okay, but this was a pretty tough day of essays. I think the juvenile delinquency part was challenging. I think definitely anytime you go to Florida con law and you start talking about homestead, that gets a little weird. Property is tough for most people generally. So that's what we saw in the Florida essays. As for the multiple choice, this is a little less surprising. Florida civil and criminal procedure are always included. They were on this exam as well. And then there were questions taken from wills and from evidence. So not a great surprise there. And those are pretty typical questions. The examiners tend to reuse a lot of questions in the multiple choice section. And that seemed to be the reaction here. They were, again, typically not very well written. They're very short questions that don't give you a lot of information, which makes it really challenging to answer them. But wills, evidence, civil and criminal procedure are the three subjects that were tested in the Florida portion altogether. So that's what we saw there. Not much else to say at this point about Florida. We are, as we're talking now, getting the Florida essays, and we're going to be drafting in our course model answers for those. So those will be coming out very shortly. As far as the multi-state goes, again, there's not a lot to say. It's a hard question. It's a hard test. There were 175 questions that count out of 200. Some people felt like the format of the questions had changed. My sense, frankly, is that if you felt like the format had changed, that probably means that was one of the 25 questions that are being evaluated for future use. We didn't get much of that feedback. I don't think it was pervasive at all. Some people were wondering if they had a harder version of the test than others. No, everyone got the same 100 questions in the morning across the country, the same 100 questions in the afternoon across the country, but the order of those 100 questions is rotated into various versions of the exam. And that can give the impression of making it more difficult for some people than for others. The sense was that it was really difficult, other than the format, to pick out what I keep wanting to call them experimental, but they're really evaluation questions. It was hard to know which ones might have been evaluation questions, but there was nothing really terribly surprising or unusual about it. We didn't get much feedback to make us think that there was anything that was problematic on the multi-state day of the exam. So that's where we stand as far as I can tell you right now. It was really interesting to hear back from my students. I think our students certainly felt good about the tests wherever they were taking them. They felt pretty calm, pretty relaxed, pretty ready to go. I hope if you took the exam, that was your experience as well. If you're feeling not comfortable about the exam, I would just say two things. One is it's normal to feel uneasy because there's really no way to know how you did. Even if you felt comfortable, you just don't know what the results are going to be. So that's normal, and don't beat yourself up about that. And secondly, I would say that an awful lot of bar takers tend to feel worse about their performance than perhaps they should, even in a day when we've got a low pass rate, which is what we're facing these days. I think people are pretty tough on themselves, so I would lighten up a little bit and relax. And again, as I said, check out the episodes we did previously about doing postmortems on the exam and waiting for your results. I think those two messages might be really helpful for you. Well, as I say, that's what we heard. We wanted to just give you a first cut at what was happening. In an upcoming episode, we'll talk about Texas and Georgia. We'll update you as we begin to get more information, as people are getting back home and kind of, taking a breath and saying, here's what I saw or what I thought was going on. And we'd love to get your comments. Feel free to drop us an email or comment on the show notes and let us know what you think. In any event, hope that this is helpful for you, whether you took the exam or you're going to be taking the exam in July or even in February 2019. I think it's useful to kind of know what was out there and what was on the test. And we'll keep you updated. And don't forget, this coming Thursday, March 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern, our webinar, How to Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. Make sure you register for that, and you'll have a choice between the live webinar with me on Thursday or the on-demand version that you can schedule any day and at any time. So that's it for today. Hope everybody has a great week. If you've just gotten back from the exam, enjoy your life away from the bar for a little while. If you're just getting geared up for July, we've got a exciting lineup ahead for you on the podcast. Lots to talk about, lots of information to share with you. And I look forward to being with you along the extra mile. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye, everybody.